Hello, my name's Carrie Good. I'm from Stroma Building Control, and I'm here to talk about the regulation updates from this year. So today's content will be covering the overview of the Building Regs Amendment 2023. So for anyone who tuned in to the last Fireby Live, I discussed the Building Safety Act. So this is a follow-on from that one. We're literally going to be covering just the building regs today, but there has been updates to the approved inspector regulations as well, and the building higher risk buildings procedures regulations 2023, as well as the Building Safety Act, which has amended again this year. So just to keep it nice and concise, we're just going to be covering the building regulations amendment to 2023 today. And just to clarify again, this is just in England, not applicable to Wales at this point in time. So just to give you a bit of background about my company, so I work for Stroma Building Control. I've been with them now for a year and a half, and we've recently gone through a merger with JHAI. So we're now the largest approved inspector across England and Wales, and we have over 44 years of experience behind the company, and we have 170 qualified surveyors across the country with 15 offices. So that's a little bit about us. So to move on to today's presentation, we're going to first have a little look at what we're going to be covering today. So we are going to be looking at what are the key changes. Again, this is going to be quite top level because there is quite a lot of detail in here, and I don't want to get you bogged down in the nitty gritty. So I'm just going to try and keep it concise to what might be applicable to yourselves as designers, building owners and contractors. So firstly, we're going to be covering what are your responsibilities in those roles, what sort of projects might be affected by these changes, what would happen if your project's already on site, does it mean anything for you, does anything change? What information do you need to provide and what stages do you need to provide the information? Who is who now in the building control world, just because there has been some changes with that, and also just going to be briefly covering what potential changes might be coming up in the pipeline. So that's what we're going to be covering off today. So we're going to jump straight in with what are the key changes. Now, slightly humorous photo at the top there because it is an absolute minefield. There are three key things that are the changes as part of this amendment. So one of the big changes is an expansion on part regulation 2A. So this introduces duty holders into the mix. It introduces more definitions, so there's clarification on who's who, and also introduces declaration of competence throughout the construction phase. So to go through this from the perspective as a client, designer, contractor. So the client has been defined as any person for whom a project is carried out. Slightly different definition for if it's a private homeowner. The client is responsible for making arrangements for planning, managing and monitoring the project, and also ensuring that all design work is carried out in compliance with the relevant regulations. So that kind of crosses over slightly with the definition of principal designer. So they have been defined as the main designer who's been directly appointed by the client and is responsible for planning, managing and monitoring the pre-construction phase of a project. So slight crossover between the client and the principal designer there. Ultimately, the client is the one who the buck will stop with, and they are the ultimate responsible person. But it is their duty to obviously select a designer to be the principal designer, to be able to make sure that the design is as reasonably compliant as possible. So the definition is to be as reasonably compliant with the design as possible. So obviously there is going to be elements that will be taken on board by the principal contractor as well. So moving on to this person, they have been defined as the person or business that commissions the construction work and has ultimate control over the construction phase of a project. So again, the principal contractor will be appointed by the client. So that will be the duty holder, the person who owns the building. They'll be appointed by them, and they will be responsible for ensuring that all building work on site is carried out in accordance with the relevant regulations. So as you can see, there's a big tie-in. Everyone has to be responsible at all the stages, and this basically is what competence is. We need to be defining competence and making sure that everyone involved in a construction program is fully competent to work. So what projects are effective? In a nutshell, if your project involves building work as defined under the building regulations statutory instrument, then you will need to comply with the new building regulations amendment 2023. So if your project's currently on site, then you can continue to operate under the building regs that were in force at the time of when you commenced on site. So, for example, if you started last year, then you can carry on operating to the building regs that were in force at the time. But if you haven't yet started on site, this is where it starts to get a bit of a grey area. So if your notice was not served and not accepted before the 1st of October this year, you will need to comply with the new amendment regulations that we are covering off today. But if you have served your notice before the 1st of October and it has been accepted, then you can continue. However, if you don't start on site before April 2024, then again, you will need to revert to the new building regulations amendment 2023. So there has been a definition change of what it means to start on site. So we're just going to jump on to the next stage, which is what information do you need to provide? So when we talk about commencement, the definition of commencement has been changed, and this can be seen in detail under Regulation 46A. So there are different definitions of commencement depending on what type of building you're working on. So to cover off the first selection of buildings, which we will call complex buildings. Now, don't be fooled by the term complex buildings, because a complex building isn't always a complex building. That sounds silly, but under the definition, shops, pubs, clubs, theatres, sports grounds, conference centres, healthcare centres that can have 100 visitors or more at any given time, and buildings with more than one basement or buildings constructed off a podium level are deemed as complex. So just to iterate again, when you hear the name complex building, it doesn't always necessarily mean it's vast and expansive and quite complicated. It's literally just anything that falls into those categories. So those sorts of buildings, commencement has been defined as the foundation supporting the building and the structure of the lowest floor has to be completed before that is deemed as starting on site or commencement. It's not been fully defined at this stage whether that includes the basement. So obviously the definition again to run through is the foundation supporting the building and the structure of the lowest floor. You would assume that a basement would be the lowest floor, but this hasn't yet been quantified yet by the regulator. So this is something that is a bit of a grey area at the moment, but I would personally, professionally assume that meant that the basement. So that's what I would assume. Again, that might not be correct. We're yet to be clarified on that. So any other building that is not deemed as a complex building, so that's any other building like just a general building or even a horizontal extension. This commencement for this sort of building is work up to and including the ground floor structure. So that is all work. So that is foundations, drainage, DPM, slab, literally up to the slab level has to be completed before the work has been deemed as commenced on site. For other types of work, so if you've got any material alterations or vertical extensions, the commencement is determined when 15% of the work that has been described on the initial notice has been completed. So again, this is a little bit grey, who gets to decide what 15% is, but when that 15% has been completed, that is then regarded as commenced on site. But it is important to note that this is not the same as started on site. So when you start on site, obviously you have to make sure that your building control provider is made aware, and they are obviously calling out as necessary at foundations, drainage, subfloor, ventilation, anything like that. They need to be making sure they're visiting at those stages. So it's not that you call them at commencement, because as we've just worked out, commencement isn't the traditional sense of commencement. So just to go through what the information you need. So obviously at the commencement stage, the client has to provide legal documentation to the building control provider now to declare that this has started on site. So it's a formal letter that goes through to them saying this has now commenced on site. And they also have to declare that they are competent and compliant with the designs and construction stages. So at the commencement stage, they also need to provide details to the building control provider of the principal designer and also the principal contractor. So obviously this information needs to be literally all gathered together and handed over as a package long before you appoint your building control, because this needs to be part of the commencement package. And going forward, you need to provide a full detailed description for the building. So that includes what the building is, what the building use is, is. If it's a multi-use building, you need to provide information on what use of each story. So, for example, if you're doing like an alteration of a shop within a high-rise building and you've got like flats at 6 levels above it, you need to include that in your detail. So that'll be obviously ground floor shop with 6 stories of residential accommodation above. You need to include drainage requirements, any specifics for the proposed work, and you also need to include the height of the building as well. So this historically was information that was generated by the building control body, basically from the plans and information submitted to them. In a nutshell, some mistakes had been made historically with people determining what the work was, what the height of the building was, because you would have to go onto like Google Earth and zoom in and see what type of building it was, because as standard, you don't always receive like the full elevations of a building, for example. So you would need to find out the information yourself. This is to remove all the work from that, remove all the guesswork, just to make sure that any information then provided is 100% correct at the time of conception. So this is very important for people in my line of work, because it just totally eradicates all the guesswork and it makes it a whole lot more easy for us. So in terms of what you do need to provide at completion, so again, you need to provide details for the principal designer and principal contractor, just to validify that it has been the same people consistently throughout the programme. You need to provide a written statement confirming that you as the client have ensured that all works are compliant, as reasonably practicable with the relevant regulations. And again, we will need written statements from both the principal contractor and the principal designer that they have fulfilled their duties in whole, they are competent and compliant, and also include the dates of their appointment. So the start, commencement date through to the end, we need to know that information. So this is all information that you as the client will need to provide going forward. So who is who in the building control world? So when we did the last seminar, we briefly touched on the new role of the building safety regulator. So we're just going to clarify a little bit more who is currently operating in building control. So the local authority building control is still operating as usual. They will now be referred to as the relevant authority as opposed to local authority building control. Again, you can still apply to them. You can apply to an approved inspector for general day-to-day building work. Approved inspector is now called a registered building inspector. They will need to be registered by April 2024 to be able to continue fulfilling the role as approved inspectors or registered building inspectors. And both the local authority building control and approved inspectors will also be going through individual competency tests between now. So this commenced on the 1st of October. We all need to make sure that we have gone through a series of tests to basically prove what level of competence we're working at, so that we can verify that we are safe to work on the buildings that we are working on. So we've got between October to April to get that done. That's not for you as a client to worry about. Obviously, we can still operate in the transitional slides, transitional arrangements, and there is obviously the new role of the building safety regulator that has been introduced. So they will be looking after all high-rise residential and high-risk buildings. If you currently have a high-rise, high-risk building, which is what we would call in flight, so that would be you've either done your initial notice, you've already done the plans assessment, you've started on site. If you've already done that piece of work, then you are able to continue with whoever your building control provider was at the time. So whether you applied through local authority or approved inspector, they are still able to undertake that work for you. It is literally going to be going forward. If you're just starting a scheme now or getting a scheme off the starting point from now, you will now need to apply through the building safety regulator. So in terms of personnel who work at local authority building control and approved inspectors, to touch back on, they will be going through these competency tests. Literally only people who have passed the highest level of competency assessment will be able to work on those high-rise, high-risk jobs. So you have peace of mind that the person who's working on it will be experienced and competent to deliver the function that you require. Obviously, because they will be carrying out the role of the building safety regulator in their place, if obviously you're going through them rather than the building safety regulator. So that is who's who in the building control world. So As you may or may not be aware, the Building Regulations Amendment 2023 is literally just a transitional phase. This is not the end of changes. It is probably one of the biggest changes that has come into the industry, certainly since I've started working in builder control, which has been 8 years now. There's been so many changes over the last years. It's quite hard to stay on top of what the changes are, what that means for who, and when they apply and what the arrangements are. But this is just the start of another larger change that's going to be happening. So there's just a little bit of information here I've grabbed from the statutory document and just put it on here just for you to read. But it's basically putting the onus back on the designers, the building owners, and basically the people who are undertaking the work to ensure that they are up to the standard we require to help buildings become more safe ultimately. So as you can see, it says the government's committed to improving accountability across the whole built environment sector. So literally, it's just making sure that everyone who is working here is safe and legal to be working in the built environment sector, because we can't have mistakes like Grenfell happening again. So this is just one of those stepping stones to helping us improve having a safer building environment. And that pretty much summarizes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Hi, Carrie, and welcome back to Firebar Live. It's great to have you here with us, and continuing the topic theme of your last session on obviously the changing regulation landscape for fire safety, which is, as we've discussed, prior to recording, a very complicated topic matter at the moment. So just a couple of questions to go through, if that's okay. And to start with, obviously with a lot of change, there comes a lot of controversy. So how has the industry responded, in your opinion, so far to these amendments to the building regulations?
I mean, it's been quite a mixed bag. Obviously, there are a lot of positives on the horizon with making sure that the wider construction industry is brought up to standard and making sure that everyone is competent to work on the projects that they are working on. But there has been a sense of information sort of being slid out there on the quiet. Just from conversations I've had with people, not many people were aware of what the new changes coming out actually meant for them. They just thought, oh, it's building regs, it's going to be building regs, building control peeps have to worry about it, not me. So it's been a bit of a shock to the system for quite a lot of people to find out that a lot of the onus has been put back on them. And again, for people from my perspective, there's a bit of a grey area, not just in my hairline, about why potentially building control personnel are the ones who are being made to go through these mandatory competence tests, where there's an onus on the client's principal designers and principal contractors to provide competence themselves and be competent and compliant throughout the entire scheme. So, there's a bit of a question mark as to why they're not the ones going through these sort of tests, at least as well. So a bit of a mixed bag. Yeah, it's quite a mixed response.
And obviously you said that a lot of people were unaware of quite how many amendments were going to be made. So given this kind of difference in changes from what we're typically used to seeing, what do you think are some of the key objectives or motivations behind these changes?
Ultimately, it is to drive safety in buildings going forward. So obviously everyone's aware of the cladding issues, ongoing cladding issues with existing high-rise buildings. We are slowly taking control of that as an industry, but it is very slow work. And for me, I believe the key objectives are to basically try and eradicate these problems going forward, making sure that everyone who is involved in a construction scheme has the knowledge and experience and levels of competence, that word again, competence, that they need to work on these jobs. Just because historically, I don't want to pick fights with anyone, but you could almost...
They might have asked Gary from down the road to do it.
Gary, yeah. It's all your fault. But Gary down the road, he set up just a contractor's business, and he could just rock up and start building things, but he didn't have to go through levels of tests, whereas obviously people who work in architects and other more what you might call like white collar professions would have to go through certain tests to be able to prove that they can do different types of work. So there's always been a bit of disparity between the person who might be doing the office-based paperwork to the person on the site. And it's basically meeting them in the middle and making sure that everyone's singing from the same hymn sheet. Let me put my teeth back in.
And obviously you discussed a lot of the primary changes in the Act, but one of them was obviously the responsibility of the responsible person and how that's grown even further. So where can people that have been designated a responsible person seek guidance maybe to keep up with these, to ensure that they're not going to be held liable for any incidents?
So this is something that I think that the powers that be potentially should have thought about a little bit more before introducing such a vast quantity of amendments, because a lot of people don't know where to find the information. I've had conversations with people and they're like, well, how was I supposed to know that this was coming in? And it's just not being made available. I would assume that the information would be on legislation.gov or potentially the HSE website, obviously, where you can get the links to apply to the BSR. But that information is not being made very available. It's not being publicised at all. So that is definitely something that going forward, because we are going to have more changes, obviously, inherently, this is just a transitional phase. It definitely should be something that is being publicised a lot more, because the people that need to know are the last to know, and that's really just not good enough.
No, definitely. And hopefully a lot of the associations and standards bodies can help try and push the message out to people, but also a building owner might not be looking at what an association is doing, as opposed to a fire engineer who obviously might have to do their competency and make sure that they're reaching that CPD level and all, etc. So yeah, it's finding the medium to reach all parties that are involved, because the entire supply chain of fire safety now, it's not just one area.
Exactly. Yeah.
Definitely. And in your perspective, what changes do you think will have maybe some of the most profound impact on the industry and safety in general?
I think that there's going to be a lot more questions asked along the chain, which is good, just because I feel like a lot of people will just kind of have the opinion, I've been doing this for X amount of time, I can just crack on and do it. So I think while we go through the transitional changes, people, especially like in my role, are going to be acting almost like more as consultants rather than building control, trying to guide their way through it. But again, one of the changes for us is that we're not going to be able to give as much advice. So it's quite a complicated one, because where we want to help the clients, because we're the ones who've been given the information and they haven't, it's quite complex, because we have to be very careful about obviously liabilities and insurances and just making sure that we're doing the right thing. So there's still a lot to be done.
Well, like everyone's in a little bit of quicksand
at the moment. It does feel like we're all in quicksand. It's like, oh no.
And lastly, just to finish off our little interview, in your opinion, are there any specific areas or elements that will require increased scrutiny? Obviously, you've mentioned a couple of these grey areas in your presentation and just now. Me too.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that just haven't, they've obviously introduced a lot of definitions, but there's a lot of things that still haven't been defined. So it was very late in the day that they introduced the definition for commencement, which is going to take a lot of people a lot of time getting used to, because who thinks that commencement will be when pretty much all the groundwork's done? It's a bit mad. There's a lot of elements like that, but for example, another question that popped up fairly recently was one whether if you've got like a shop within a block of flats, would that be classed as a high-rise, high-risk building? And therefore, if I was approached as a registered building inspector, would I be able to take on that work, or would I have to forward them to the BSR? That was grey until like literally a few days ago, and there's just things like this are just literally, until you literally come across an instance like that, or a question that you might not have thought of, they're just not getting ironed out, and there's still plenty. So watch this space.
You'll be back at every event for the
I
next
will
few
be
years.
here every
No,
year.
so these are the next changes to this specific act.
Yep.
You should start a Carrie series.
Yep.
And I suppose lastly also, I mean, well, first of all, what was the outcome of that scenario, you know, with the shop in the high rise you just mentioned?
Yeah, it has at the moment as it stands, people who aren't obviously a building safety regulator can work on a shop, which is, say, at the bottom of a high-rise building, whereas it was sort of thought before, because it's part of a high-rise, high-risk building, you wouldn't be able to work on it. But there is a strict definition that, for example, like if it's like a first-floor office, it has to have a completely separate entrance and exit to the flat. So if it's got a shared exit and entrance, then obviously it would have to go to the building safety regulator. I say obviously because it's not obvious whatsoever. It's really not.
I was going to say, I was like, okay, yeah.
Obviously.
Okay.
I mean, how wouldn't you know?
No, exactly. Well, I think it's always going to be difficult to completely iron out every single individual scenario, because naturally we're in an urban landscape now. Urbanization and cities are growing, you know, across vast areas of land that was previously unpopulated for a reason, whether it's flood risk, whether it's, you know, wildfires, you know, all these different areas. So to navigate that built landscape is always going to be, you know, difficult, but I think like we've established, communication is key. Yeah, you know, get the information out there.
Talk to your colleagues. Like, we're all a big giant construction team. We're not here to fight each other. Like, use each other to find out, because there'll be stuff that I don't know, and I'll have to ask someone in a different company. And you know, we're all fighting for the same purpose. We don't have to fight each other, you know, just utilize each other. That's all I can say, really. Yeah.
No, wise words to end on. So thank you, Carrie.
Thank you.
Always appreciate your insight, and it's, you know, like we said, such an incredibly complex subject.
It is, and I'm sure I'll be back with the next episode.
If anybody would like to find out more, then please don't hesitate to reach out and connect with Carrie on the platform. You can also catch her previous session on demand in the platform as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much.